streets of the walls of Tyr, where the first thing Rand noticed was the absence of guards. Despite the lofty stone ramparts with their towers, the city was less defended than steading Shanghai, where he and every other human had been gently but firmly refused entrance at first light. Here, the archers' balconies on the towers were empty. The iron-strapped door of the squat gray guardhouse just inside the broad gates stood wide open, and a hard-faced woman in rough woolens, her sleeves shoved up her thin arms, sat there at a wooden tub, scrubbing clothes with a washboard. She appeared to have taken up residence. Two small grubby children, sucking their thumbs, stared wide-eyed past her at him and his companions. At their horses, at least. Tie-Dye Shah was a sight to stare at. A sleek black stallion with a massive chest, a horse that drew attention, yet he had chosen to ride the animal anyway. If the Forsaken could find him as easily as they had at Elgaren's manor house, there was little point to hiding, or at least to putting too much effort into it. He wore black riding gloves to conceal the dragon's heads on his hands and the herons branded into his palms. His coat was dark gray wool without a stitch of embroidery, the stallion's saddlecloth simple, and his sword's hilt and scabbard had been covered in unworked boar hide ever since it came into his possession. Nothing to pull a second glance. Cadswain, in unadorned gray wool, wore the hood of her dark green cloak well up to shield her Aes Sedai face, but Min, Nynaeve, and Olivia had no need for hiding. Though Min's flower-embroidered red coat and snug breeches might attract a little notice, not to mention her heeled red boots. He had seen women in Kyrian wearing clothes like that, copying her, yet it seemed unlikely that her fashion had spread to Tyr, where modesty held sway. In public, at least. Nynaeve was wearing yellow-slashed blue silk, and all of her jewelry, just partly concealed by her blue cloak, but Tyr would be full of silks. She had wanted to wear her shawl. That was in her saddlebags, though. A little effort only. The second thing he noticed was the sound, a rhythmic, racketing clatter, accompanied periodically by a piercing whistle. Faint at first, it seemed to be coming closer rapidly. Despite the early hour, the streets he could see from the gates were crowded. Half the people inside appeared to be sea folk, the men bare-chested, the women in bright linen blouses, all wearing long slashes more colorful than those worn by Tyran commoners. Every head appeared to be turned toward that sound. Children darted through the throng, dodging carts, most often pulled by oxen with wide horns, racing toward the noise. Several well-dressed men and women had dismounted from their sedan chairs and stood with their bearers to watch. A fork-bearded merchant with silver chains across the chest of his coat was half out of the window of a red-lacquered coach, shouting at his driver to manage the nervously dancing team while he strained for a better view. White-winged pigeons, startled from pointed slate rooftops by a particularly sharp whistle, suddenly wheeled into the air, and two large flocks crashed into one another, pelting the folk below with stunned birds. Every single bird fell. A few people actually stopped staring toward the approaching noise and gaped at the sky. A surprising number snatched up fallen birds and wrung their necks, though, and not just barefoot people in worn woolens. A woman in silk and lace, standing beside one of the sedan chairs, quickly gathered half a dozen before gazing toward the noise, with the birds dangling from her hands by their feet. Olivia made a startled sound. "Is that ill luck or good?" she drawled. "It must be ill, unless pigeons here are different." Nynaeve gave her a sour look, but said nothing. She had been very quiet since Lan vanished the day before, a subject on which she was doubly silent. "Some of those people are going to die of hunger," Min said sadly. The bond quivered with sorrow. "Every last one I can see something about." "How can I hide?" Roose Theron laughed. "I am Taviran." "You're dead," Rand thought of him sharply. People in front of him were going to starve, and he laughed. There was nothing to be done, of course, not when Min spoke, but laughing was another matter. "I am Taviran. Me." What else was happening in Tyr because of his presence? His being Taviran did not always have any effect at all, but when it did, the result could blanket an entire city. Best to get on with what he had come for before the wrong people figured out what things like pigeons flying into one another meant. If the Forsaken were sending armies of Trollocs and Myrddraal after him, it was likely that Dark Friends would take any opportunity to put an arrow through his ribs. Making little effort to hide was not the same as making no effort. You might as well have brought the Banner of Light and an honor guard of thousands instead of 6, Cadsuane murmured dryly, eyeing the maidens who were trying to pretend they had nothing to do with Rand's party while standing in a wide circle around it, Shufa covering their heads and veils hanging down their chests. 2 were shy, though, fierce-eyed whenever they looked at him. The maidens' spears were all on their backs, stuck through the harness of their bow cases, but only because Rand had offered to leave them behind and take someone else otherwise. Mandera had insisted on at least a few maidens, staring at him with eyes as hard as emeralds. He had never considered refusing. The only child of a maiden any maiden had ever known, he had obligations to meet. He gathered Tidashar's reins, and abruptly a large wagon full of machinery came into sight, clanking and hissing, wide iron-studded wheels striking sparks from the gray paving stones as it moved along the street as fast as a man could trot. The machinery seemed to sweat steam. A heavy wooden shaft swung up and down, pushing another vertical shaft, and gray wood smoke drifted from a metal chimney. But there was no sign of a horse, just an odd sort of tiller in the front to turn the wheels. One of the 3 men standing in the wagon pulled a long cord, and steam rushed in a shrill whistle out of a tube atop a huge iron cylinder. If the onlookers stared in awe and maybe covered their ears, the fork-bearded merchant's team was in no such mood. Whinnying wildly, they bolted, scattering people as they ran and nearly pitching the man out on his head. Curses pursued them, and several braying mules that galloped off with their drivers in bouncing carts, sawing at the reins. Even a few oxen began to lumber along more quickly. Min's astonishment filled the bond. Controlling the black with his knees, trained as warhorse, Tidashar responded immediately, though he still snorted. Rand stared in amazement too. It seemed Master Pole actually had made his steam wagon work. "But how did you get the thing to Tyr?" he asked the heir. The last he had seen, it had been at the Academy of Cairhien, and seizing up every few paces. "It's called a steam horse, my lord," a barefoot, dirty-faced urchin in a ragged shirt said, bouncing on the pavement. Even the sash holding up his baggy breeches seemed as much holes as cloth. "I've seen it 9 times. Tom here's only seen it 7. "A steam wagon, Donnie," his equally ragged companion put in. "A steam wagon." Neither of them could have been more than 10, and they were gaunt rather than skinny. Their muddy feet, torn shirts, and old breeches meant they came from outside the walls, where the poorest folk lived. Rand had changed a number of laws in Tyr, especially those that weighed down heavily on the poor, but he had been unable to change everything. He had not even known how to begin. Luce Theron began to maunder on about taxes and money-creating jobs, but he might as well have been spilling out words at random for all the sense he made. Rand muted the voice to a buzz, a fly on the other side of a room. 4 of them hitched together, one behind the other, pulled 100 wagons all the way from Cairhien," Donnie went on, ignoring the other boy. "They covered near 100 miles every day, my lord. 100 miles!" Com sighed heavily. "There were 6 of them, Donnie, and they only pulled 50 wagons, but they covered more than 100 miles every day. 120 some days, I heard, and it was one of the steam men said it." Donnie turned to scowl at him, the pair of them balling up fists. "Either way, it's a remarkable achievement," Rand told them quickly, before they could begin trading blows. "Here." Dipping into his coat pocket, he pulled out 2 coins and tossed one toward each boy without looking to see what they were. Gold glittered in the air before the boys eagerly snatched the coins. Exchanging startled glances, they went running out through the gates as fast as they could go, no doubt fearful he would demand the coins back. Their families could live for months on that much gold. Min gazed after them with an expression of misery that the bond echoed even after she shook her head and smoothed her face. What had she seen? Death, probably. Rand felt anger, but no sorrow. How many tens of thousands would die before the last battle was done? How many would be children? He had no room left in him for sorrow. Very generous, Nynaeve said in a tight voice. But are we going to stand here all morning? The steam wagon was moving on out of sight quickly, yet her plump brown mare was still blowing anxiously and tossing her head, and she was having difficulty with the animal, placid as it was by nature. She was far from as good a rider as she thought herself. For that matter, Min's mount, an arch-necked gray mare from Elgaren's stables, danced so that only Min's firm red-gloved grip on the reins kept her from running. And Olivia's roan was trying to dance, though the former Damani controlled the animal as easily as Catswain did her bay. Olivia sometimes displayed surprising talents. Damani were expected to ride well. As they rode into the city, Rand took a last glance at the disappearing steam wagon. Remarkable was hardly the word. 100 wagons are only 50. Only. Incredible was more like it. Would merchants start using those things instead of horses? It hardly seemed likely. Merchants were conservative folk, not known for leaping at new ways of doing things. For some reason, Lews Therin began laughing again. Tyr was not beautiful, like Caemlyn or Tar Valon, and few of its streets could be called particularly broad. But it was large and sprawling, one of the great cities of the world, and, like most great cities, a jumble that had grown up willy-nilly. In those tangled streets, tile-roofed inns and slate-roofed stables, the roof corners slanted sharply, stood alongside palaces with squared white domes and tall balcony-ringed towers that often came to points, the heights of domes and towers gleaming in the early morning sun. Smithies and cutlers, seamstresses and butchers, fishmongers and rug-weavers' shops rubbed against marble structures with tall bronze doors behind massive white columns, guild halls and bankers' and merchants' exchanges. At this hour, the streets themselves were still cast in deep shadows, yet they bustled with that storied southern industry. Sedan chairs borne by pairs of lean men wove through the crowds almost as quickly as the children who raced about in play, while coaches and carriages behind teams of 4 or 6 moved as slowly as the carts and wagons, most drawn by large oxen. Porters trudged along, their bundles slung beneath poles carried on 2 men's shoulders, and apprentices carried rolled carpets and boxes of the master's handiwork on their backs. Hawkers cried their wares from trays or hand barrows, pins and ribbons, a few with roasted nuts and meat pies, and tumblers or jugglers or musicians performed at nearly every intersection. You would never have thought this city was the site of a siege. Not everything was peaceful, though. Early morning or not, Rand saw obstreperous drunks being thrown out of inns and taverns, and so many fistfights and men wrestling on the pavement that it seemed one pair was not well out of sight before the next came into view. A good many obvious armsmen mingled in the crowd, swords at their hips and the fat sleeves of their woolen coats striped in various house colors, but even those wearing breastplates and helmets made no move to break up the line. A fair number of the fights involved armsmen, with each other, with sea-folk, with roughly clad fellows who might have been laborers or apprentices, or shoulder-thumpers. Soldiers with nothing to do grew bored. Bored soldiers got drunk and fought. He was glad to see the rebels' armsmen bored. The maidens, drifting through the throng and still trying to pretend they had no association with Rand, threw puzzled looks and head-scratching, mainly from dark-faced sea-folk, though a gaggle of children trailed after them gaping. The Tyrants, many of whom were not all that much fairer than the sea-folk, had seen Aiel before, and if they wondered why they had returned to the city, it appeared they had different business at hand this morning, and more important. No one seemed to give Rand or his other companions a second glance. There were other mounted men and women in the streets, most of them outlanders. Here a pale Carianan merchant in a somber coat, there an Arafellan with silver bells fastened to his dark braids, here a Capuchin Domani in a barely opaque riding dress, barely hidden by her cloak, followed by a pair of hulking bodyguards in leather coats sewn with steel discs. There a Shinaran with his head shaved except for a gray topknot, and his belly straining his buttons. You could not move 10 paces in Tyr without seeing outlanders. Tyran commerce had long arms. Which was not to say that he passed through the city without incident. Ahead of him, a running baker's boy tripped and fell, flinging his basket into the air, and when the boy levered himself off the paving stones as Rand rode by, he stopped halfway up with his mouth hanging open, staring at the long loaves, standing on end near the basket, propped together in a rough cone. A fellow in his shirt sleeves, drinking in the second-story window of an inn, overbalanced and toppled toward the street with a shriek that cut off when he landed on his feet not 10 paces from Tidashar, mug still in hand. Rand left him behind wide-eyed and feeling at himself in wonderment. Ripples of altered chance were following Rand through the city, spreading across the city. Not every event would be as harmless as the loaves or as beneficial as the man landing on his feet rather than his head. Those ripples could turn what should be a bruiseless tumble into broken bones or a broken neck. Lifelong feuds could be started by men speaking words they had never thought to hear come from their own lips. Women could decide to poison their husbands over trivial offenses they had tolerated complacently for years. Oh, some fellow might find a rotting sack full of gold buried in his own basement without really knowing why he had decided to dig in the first place. Or a man might ask and gain the hand of a woman he had never before had the courage to approach. But as many would find ruination as found good fortune. Balance, Min had called it. A good to balance every ill. He saw an ill to balance every good. He needed to be gone this year, and gone as soon as possible. Galloping in those crowded streets was out of the question, but he picked up his pace enough that the maidens had to trot. His destination had been in sight since long before he entered the city. A mass of stone, like a barren, sheer-sided hill that stretched from the river Ernin into the city's heart, covering at least 8 or 9 marches, a good square mile or more, and dominating the city's sky. The stone of Tyr was mankind's oldest stronghold, the oldest structure in the world, made with the water power in the last days of the breaking itself. One solid piece of stone it was, without a single grain, though better than 3,000 years of rain and wind have weathered the surface to roughness. The first battlements stood 100 paces above the ground, though there were arrow slits aplenty lower, and stone spouts for showering attackers with boiling oil or molten lead. No besieger could stop the stone from being supplied through its own wall-shielded docks, and it contained forges and manufactories to replace or mend every sort of weapon should its armories fall short. Its highest tower, rearing over the very center of the stone, held the banner of Tyr, half red, half gold, with a slanting line of 3 silver crescents, and so large that it could be made out plainly as it curled in a strong breeze. It had to be strong to move that flag. Lower towers supported smaller versions, but here they alternated with another rippling banner, the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai, black and white on a field of red. The banner of light, the dragon banner, some called it, as if there were not another that bore that name. The High Lord Darlin was flaunting his allegiance, it seemed. That was well. Alana was in there, and whether or not that was well, he would have to learn. He was not as sharply aware of her as before Elaine and Avienda and Min jointly bothered him. He thought he was not. They had pushed her aside to take primacy somehow, and she had told him she could sense little more of him than his presence. Yet she still lay in the back of his head, a bundle of emotions and physical sensations. It seemed a long time since he had been near enough to her to sense those. Once again, the bond with her felt an intrusion, a would-be usurper of his bond to Min and Elaine and Avienda. Alana was weary, as if perhaps she had not been getting enough sleep lately, and frustrated, with strong streaks of anger and sulkiness. Were the negotiations going badly? He would find out soon enough. She would be aware he was in the city, aware he was coming closer, if little more. Min had tried to teach him a trick called masking that supposedly could hide him from the bond, but he had never been able to make it work. Of course, she admitted she had never been able to make it work either. Soon he found himself on a street that ran directly to the plaza that surrounded the stone on three sides, but he had no intention of riding straight there. For one thing, every massive iron-strapped gate would be barred tight. For another, he could see several hundred armsmen at the foot of the street. He expected there would be the same in front of every gate. They hardly gave the impression of men besieging a fortress. They seemed to be lounging about with no order. Many had their helmets off, and their halberds propped against the buildings lining the street, and serving women from nearby taverns and inns circulated among them, selling mugs of ale or wine from trays. Yet it was highly unlikely they would remain complacent about anyone trying to enter the stone. Not that they could stop him, of course. He could sweep aside a few hundred men like so many moths. He had not come to kill anyone, though, not unless he had to. So he rode into the stable yard of a tile-roofed inn, 3 stories of dark gray stone with a prosperous look. The sign out front was freshly painted with, of all things, a rough approximation of the creatures encircling his forearms. The artist apparently had decided the thing was inadequate as described, though, because he had added long, sharp teeth and leathery, ribbed wings. Wings! They almost looked copied from one of those Shonchan flying beasts. Cadswain looked at the sign and snorted. Nynaeve looked at it and giggled. So did Min. Even after Rand gave the barefoot stable boys silver to curry the horses, they stared at the maidens harder than at the coins, but no harder than the patrons stared in the dragon's beam-ceiling common room. Conversation trailed off when the maidens followed Rand and the others inside, spear points sticking up above their heads and bullhide bucklers in hand. Men and women, most in plain, if good quality wool, turned in their low-backed chairs to stare. They seemed to be middling merchants and solid craftsfolk, yet they gaped like villagers seeing a city for the first time. The serving women, in dark high-necked dresses and short white aprons, stopped trotting and goggled over their trays. Even the woman playing a hammered dulcimer between the 2 stone fireplaces, cold on this fine morning, fell silent. A very dark fellow with tightly curled hair, at a square table beside the door, seemed not to notice the maidens at all. Rand took him for one of the sea folk at first, though he wore a peculiar coat without collar or lapels, once white but now stained and wrinkled. I tell you, I have many of the worms that make silk on a ship, he said haltingly in an odd musical accent. But I must have and berry leaves to feed them. We will be rich. His companion waved a plump, dismissive hand, even while staring at the maidens. Worms, he said absently. Everybody knows silk grows on trees. Walking deeper into the common room, Rand shook his head as the proprietor advanced to meet him. Worms. The tales people could come up with to try prying coin out of somebody. A garde au sarange at your service, my lord, my ladies, the lean balding man said with a deep bow, sweeping his hands wide. Not all Tyrans were dark by any means, but he was nearly as fair-complected as a Kyrianan. How may I serve? His dark eyes kept drifting to the maidens, and every time they did, he tugged at his long blue coat as though it suddenly felt too tight. We want a room with a good view of the stone, Rand said. It is worms that make silk, friend, a man drawled behind him. My eye is on it. At that familiar accent, Rand spun to find Olivia staring, wide-eyed, and her face bloodless, at a man in a dark coat who was just passing through the doorway into the street. With an oath, Rand ran to the door, but there were close to a dozen men in dark coats walking away from the inn, any one of whom might have spoken. There was no way to pick out one man of average height and width, seen only from behind. What was a Shonchan doing in Tyr? Scouting for another invasion? He would put paid to that soon enough. But he turned from the door, wishing he could have laid hands on the man. Knowing would be better than having to guess. He asked Olivia whether she had gotten a good look at the fellow, but she shook her head silently. Her face was still pale. She was ferocious when she talked of what she wanted to do to Suldam, yet it seemed just hearing the accents of her native land was enough to shake her. He hoped that did not turn out to be weakness in her. She was going to help him somehow, and he could not afford her to be weak. "What do you know of this man who just left?" he demanded of Sarange. "The one with the slurred way of talking." The innkeeper blinked. "Nothing, my lord. I've never seen him before." "You want one room, my lord?" He ran his eyes over Min and the other women, and his lips moved as if he were counting. "If you're thinking of any impropriety, Master Sarange," Nynaeve said indignantly, tugging at the braid hanging from the cowl of her cloak, "you had best think twice and again, before I box your ears." Min hissed softly, and one hand drifted toward her other wrist before she checked the motion. Likely she was quick to reach for her knives. "What impropriety?" Olivia asked in tones of puzzlement. Cadsuane snorted. "One room," Rand said patiently. Women can always find a reason to be indignant, he thought. Or had there been Luce Theron? He shrugged in discomfort, and a touch of irritation that he only just managed to keep out of his voice. "Your largest with a view of the stone. We don't want it for long. You'll be able to rent it out again for tonight. You may have to keep our horses a day or two, though." A look of relief crept over Sarange's narrow face, though patently false rue filled his voice. "I regret that my largest room is taken, my lord. In fact, all of my large rooms are taken, but I will be more than happy to escort you up the street to the Three Moons and—" "Faugh!" Cadsuane pushed back her hood enough to reveal her face and some of her golden hair ornaments. She was all cool composure, her gaze implacable. "I think you can find a way to make that room available, boy. I think you had better find a way. Pay him well," she added to Rand, ornaments swaying on their chains. That was advice, not an order. Sarange took Rand's fat golden crown with alacrity. It was doubtful the entire inn earned much more in a week. But it was Cadsuane's ageless face that sent him bounding up the staircase at the back of the common room, to return in a handful of minutes and show them to a room on the second floor with dark polished paneling and a rumpled bed wide enough for three, flanked by a pair of windows filled by the stone looming over the rooftops. The previous occupant had been hustled out so quickly that he had left a woolen stocking crumpled at the foot of the bed and a carved horn comb on the washstand in the corner. The innkeeper offered to have their saddlebags brought up, and wine, and seemed surprised when Rand refused, but one glance at Cadsuane's face, and he bowed his way out again hurriedly. The room was fairly large, as inn rooms went, yet not compared to most chambers in Algaren's manor house, much less in a palace, especially not with near a dozen people filling the space. The walls seemed to close in on Rand. His chest suddenly felt tight. Every breath came with difficulty. The bond was suddenly full of sympathy and concern. "The box," Luce Theron panted. "Have to get out of the box." Keeping his eyes on the windows, being able to see the stone was a necessity, and seeing open air between the dragon and the stone, the open air above loosened his breathing a little. Just a little. Keeping his eyes fixed on the sky above the stone, he ordered everyone to stand against the walls. They obeyed with speed. Well, Cadsuane gave him a sharp look before gliding to the wall, and Nynaeve sniffed before flouncing over, but the rest moved quickly. If they thought he wanted space for safety's sake, in a way he did. Having them out of his line of sight made the room seem a little larger. Only a little, yet every inch was a blessed relief. The bond was filled with concern. "Must get out," Luce Theron moaned. "Have to get out." Stiffening himself against what he knew would come, watchful of any attempt by Lews Therin, Rand seized the male half of the true source, and Saladin flowed into him. Had the madman tried to seize it first? He had brushed it, certainly, touched it, but it was Rand's. Mountains of flame collapsing in fiery avalanches tried to scour him away. Waves that made ice seem warm tried to crush him in raging seas. He gloried in it, suddenly so alive it seemed he had been sleepwalking before. He could hear the breath of everyone in the room, could see that great banner atop the stone so clearly he almost thought he could make out the weave of the fabric. The double wound in his side throbbed as if trying to rip itself out of his body. But with the power filling him, he could ignore that pain. He thought he could have ignored a sword thrust. Yet with Saladin came the inevitable violent nausea, the almost overwhelming desire to double over and empty himself of every meal he had ever eaten. His knees trembled with it. He fought that as hard as he fought the power, and Saladin had to be fought ever and always. A man forced Saladin to his will, or it destroyed him. The face of the man from Shadar floated in his head for a moment. He looked furious, and near to sicking up. Without any doubt, he was aware of Rand in that moment, and Rand of him. Move a hair in any direction, and they would touch. No more than a hair. "What's the matter?" Nynaeve demanded, moving close and peering up at him in concern. "Your face has gone all gray." She reached for his head, and his skin popped out in goosebumps. He brushed her hands away. "I'm all right. Stand clear." She stood there, giving him one of those looks women carried in their belt pouches. This one said she knew he was lying, even if she could not prove it. Did they practice those looks in front of mirrors? "Stand clear, Nynaeve." "He's all right, Nynaeve," Min said, though her face had a touch of gray about it too, and she had both red-gloved hands pressed to her middle. She knew. Nynaeve sniffed at him, wrinkling her nose in disdain, but she finally moved out of his way. Maybe Lan had had enough and run away. No, not that. Lan would not leave her unless she told him to, and then only for as long as was needful. Wherever he was, Nynaeve knew, and likely had sent him there for reasons of her own. Aes Sedai and their bloody secrets. He channeled, spirit touched with fire, and the familiar vertical silvery slash appeared at the foot of the bed. It seemed to rotate into a dim view of massive columns in darkness. Light from the in-room gave all the illumination. The opening, standing inches above the floor, was no larger than the door to the room. Yet as soon as it was fully open, 3 of the maidens, already veiled, darted through, pulling spears free, and Rand's skin pebbled again as Olivia leaped after them. Protecting him was a self-imposed duty, but one she took as seriously as the maidens did. There would be no ambush here, though, no dangers, so he stepped through and down. At the other end, the gateway sat more than a foot above the huge gray slabs of stone that he had not wanted to damage any more than he already had. This was the heart of the stone, and with the power in him, and the light spilling from the gateway from the room in the dragon, he could see the narrow hole in one of those stones where he had driven Kalandor into the floor. Who draws it out shall follow after. He had thought long and hard before sending Narishma to bring Kalandor to him. However, the prophecies meant the man was to follow. Narishma was otherwise occupied today. A forest of immense redstone columns surrounded him, stretching up into the dark that hid the unlit golden lamps and the vaulted ceiling and the great dome. His boots echoed hollowly in the vast chamber, and even the whispers of the maidens' soft boots. In this space, the sense of confinement vanished. Min hopped down right behind him, with a throwing knife in either hand, and her head swiveling, eyes searching the darkness. The Cadswain, standing at the edge of the gateway, said, "I don't jump unless I absolutely have to, boy." She held out a hand, waiting for him to take it. He handed her down, and she nodded thanks. It could have been meant for thanks. It could have meant you took your bloody time about it, too. A ball of light appeared over her upturned palm, and a moment later Olivia was balancing a globe of light too. The pair created a pool of brightness that turned the surrounding darkness deeper. Nynaeve required the same courtesy, and had the grace to murmur thanks. She quickly gained her own ball of light, but when he offered a hand to one of the maidens, he thought it was Sarendra, one of the Shido, though all he could see of her face was blue eyes above her black veil. She grunted contemptuously and leaped down, spear in hand, followed by the other two. He let the gateway close, but held on to Sayadine, despite the roiling in his stomach and head. He did not expect to need to channel again before he left the stone, yet he did not want to give Lews Therin another opportunity to seize the power either. "You have to trust me," Lews Therin snarled. "If we're going to make it to Tarmangaiden so we can die, you have to trust me." "You told me once not to trust anyone," Rand thought, "including you." "Only madmen trust no one," Lews Therin whispered. Abruptly he began to weep. "Oh, why do I have a madman in my head?" Rand pushed the voice away. On striding through the tall arch that led from the heart, he was surprised to find two defenders of the stone in ridged helmets and shining breastplates, the puffy sleeves of their black coats striped in black and gold. Swords drawn, they were staring at the archway with expressions that combined confusion with grim resolution. Doubtless, they had been startled to see lights and hear footsteps echoing in a room with only one entrance, an entrance they were guarding. The maidens crouched, spears coming up, spreading out to either side, slowly curling in toward the pair. "By the stone, it's him!" one of the men said, sheathing his sword hurriedly. Stocky, with a puckered scar that began on his forehead and journeyed across the bridge of his nose and down to his jaw, he bowed deeply, hands in steel-backed gauntlets spreading wide. "My lord dragon," he said. "Yagan Handar, my lord. The stone stands. I got this that day." He touched the scar on his face. "An honorable wound, Handar, and a day to remember," Rand told him as the other, leaner man hastily put up his blade and bowed. Only then did the maidens lower their spears, but their faces remained veiled. A day to remember? Trollocs and Murdral inside the stone. The second time he had truly wielded Kalandor, using the sword that was not a sword as it was meant to be used. The dead lying everywhere. A dead girl he could not make live again. Who could forget such a day? "I know I gave orders for the heart to be guarded while Kalandor was there, but why are you still standing guard?" The two men exchanged puzzled looks. "You gave the order to set guards, my lord dragon," Handar said, "and the defenders obey. But you never said anything about Kalandor except that no one was to approach it unless they had proof they came from you." Suddenly the stocky man gave a start and bowed again, more deeply still. "Forgive me, my lord, if I seem to question you. I don't mean to. Shall I summon the High Lords to your apartments? Your rooms have been kept in readiness for your return." "No need," Rand told him. "Darlin will be expecting me, and I know where to find him." Handar winced. The other man suddenly found something interesting on the floor to study. "You may require a guide, my lord," Handar said slowly. "The corridors. Sometimes the corridors change." So, the pattern truly was loosening. That meant the Dark One was touching the world more than he had since the War of the Shadow. If it loosened too much before Tarmangaiden, the age lace might unravel. An end to time and reality and creation. Somehow he had to bring about the last battle before that happened. Only he did not dare. Not yet. He assured Handar and the other man that he needed no guide, and the pair of them bowed yet again, apparently accepting the Dragon Reborn could do anything he said he could do. In simple truth, he knew he could locate Alana. He could have pointed straight at her. And she had moved since he first felt her. To find Darlin and inform him that Randall Thor was approaching, he was sure. Min had named her as one he held in his hand, yet Aes Sedai always found a way to play both ends against the middle. They always had schemes of their own, goals of their own. Witness Nynaeve and Varen. Witness any of them. They hop when you say toad, Cadsuane said coolly, pushing the cowl of her cloak down her back as they walked away from the heart. That can be bad for you when too many people jump at your word. She had the nerve to say that. Cadsuane bloody Maligran? I'm fighting a war, he told her harshly. Menage had his temper on edge. That was part of the reason he was harsh. The fewer people who obey, the more chance I'll lose, and if I lose, everybody loses. If I could make everybody obey, I would. There were far too many who did not obey as it was, or obeyed in their own way. Why in the life would Nin feel pity? Cadsuane nodded. As I thought, she murmured half to herself. And what was that supposed to mean? The stone had all the trappings of a palace, from silk tapestries and rich runners in the corridors, from Tarabon and Eltara and Tyr itself, to golden stands holding mirrored lamps. Chests standing against the stone walls might be for storing what the servants needed for cleaning, yet they were of rare woods, often elaborately carved and always with gilded banding. Niches held bowls and vases of sea-folk porcelain, thin as leaves and worth many times their weight in gold, or massive gem-studded figures. A golden leopard with ruby eyes trying to pull down a silver deer with pearl-covered antlers that stood a pace tall. A golden lion that was even taller, with emerald eyes and fire drops for claws. Others set so extravagantly with gems that no metal showed. Servants in black and gold
Hey,
livery
Soy, how
bowed
you
and
doing?
curtsied as Rand climbed through the stone, those who recognized him very deeply indeed. Some eyes widened at the sight of the maidens trailing behind, but their surprise never slowed their curtsies. All the trappings of a palace, yet the stone had been designed for war within as well as without. Wherever two corridors crossed, murder holes dotted the ceiling. Between the tapestries, arrow slits pierced the walls high up, angled to cover the corridors in both directions, and no flight of sweeping stairs, but had arrow slits placed so the staircase could be swept by arrows or crossbow bolts. Only one assailant had ever succeeded in forcing a way into the stone, the Aiel, and they had swept over the opposition too quickly for many of those defenses to come into play. But any other enemy that managed to get inside the stone would pay a price in blood for every hallway. Except that traveling had changed warfare forever. Traveling and blossoms of fire and so much more. That blood price would still be paid, yet stone walls and high towers could no longer hold back an assault. The Ashaman had made the stone as obsolete as the bronze swords and stone axes men had often been reduced to in the breaking. Mankind's oldest stronghold was now a relic. The bond with Alana led him up and up until he came to tall, polished doors with golden leopards for door handles. She was on the other side. Life
How
in
you
his
doing,
stomach wanted to
Soy?
empty itself. Hardening himself, he pulled
What to
open
do
one of the
here?
doors and
Let's
went
start.
in, leaving the maidens to stand guard.
Let's start this safety
Nin on the
meeting off with
others
a
followed
dab.
him in. The sitting room was almost as ornate as his own apartments in the stone. The walls hung with broad silk tapestries, showing scenes of the hunt and battle. The large patterned Tarabana carpet on the floor, worth sufficient gold to feed a large village for a year. The black marble fireplace tall enough for a man to walk into, and wide enough to hold 8 abreast. Every piece of furnishing, all massively made, was elaborately carved, crusted with gilt and dotted with gems, as were the tall golden stand lamps, their mirrored flames adding to the light let in by the glass-paned ceiling. A golden bear with ruby eyes and silver claws and teeth, more than a pace high, stood atop a gilded plinth on one side of the room, while an identical plinth held an emerald-eyed, ruby-taloned eagle nearly as tall. Restraint pieces for Tyr. Seated in an armchair, Alana looked up as he walked in, and held out a golden goblet for one of the 2 young serving women in black and gold to fill with dark wine from a tall golden pitcher. Slender in a gray riding dress slashed with green, Alana was beautiful enough that Lews Theron began humming to himself. Rand examined his earlobe before snatching his hand down, suddenly unsure whether to say Lews or the madman. She smiled, but darkly, and as her eyes swept across Min and Nynaeve, Olivia and Cadswain, the bond between her suspicion, not to mention anger and sadness. The last two heightened for Cadswain, and there was joy as well, mixed in all the rest, when her gaze touched him. Not that it showed in her voice. "Why, who would have expected you, my Lord Dragon?" she murmured, with a hint of asperity in the title. "Quite a surprise, wouldn't you say, my Lord Asterill?" So she had not warned anyone after all. Interesting. "A very pleasant surprise," an elderly man with red and blue striped sleeves said with a bow, stroking his hair trimmed to a point. The High Lord Asterill Damara's face was creased, the hair that hung to his shoulders snow white and thinning, but his back was straight and his dark eyes sharp. "I've been looking forward to this day for some time." He bowed again to Cadswain and after a moment to Nynaeve. "Aes Sedai," he said, very civil for Tyr, where channeling, if not Aes Sedai themselves, had been outlawed before Rand altered the law. Darlin Cisnera, High Lord and Steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn, in a green silk coat with yellow striped sleeves and gold-worked boots, was less than a head shorter than Rand, with close-cut hair and a pointed beard, a bold nose, and blue eyes that were rare in Tyr. Those eyes widened as he turned from a conversation with Caroline Damodred near the fireplace. The Carianan noblewoman gave Rand a jolt, though he had expected to see her here. The litany he used to forge his soul in fire almost started up in his head before he could stop it. Short and slim and pale, with large dark eyes and a small ruby dangling onto her forehead from a golden chain woven into the black hair falling in waves to her shoulders, she was the very image of her cousin Moiraine. Of all things, she wore a long blue coat embroidered in golden scrolls, except for the horizontal stripes of red, green, and white that ran from neck to hem over snug green breeches and heeled blue boots. It seemed the fashion had traveled after all. She made a curtsy, even so, though it looked odd in that garb. Lews Theron hummed even harder, making Rand wish the man had a face so he could hit him. Moiraine was a memory for hardening his soul, not for humming at. "My Lord Dragon," Darlin said, bowing stiffly. He was not a man accustomed to offering the first curtsy. He gave no bow for Cadswain, just a sharp look before he seemed to dismiss her presence entirely. She kept him and Caroline as guests for a time in Cairhien. He was unlikely to forget that, or forgive. At his gesture, the two serving women moved quickly to offer wine. As might have been expected, Cadswain, with her ageless face, received the first goblet, but surprisingly, Nynaeve got the second. The Dragon Reborn was one thing, a woman wearing the Great Serpent Ring something else again, even in Tyr. Throwing her cloak back, Cadswain retreated to the wall. It was unlike her to be retiring, but then from there she could observe everyone at once. Olivia took a place by the door, doubtless for much the same reason. "I'm glad to see you better than when I saw you last," Darlin went on. "You've done me great honor, though I may yet lose my head for it if your Aes Sedai make no more progress than they have." "Don't be sulky, Darlin," Caroline murmured, her throaty voice sounding amused. "Men do sulk, do they not, Min?" For some reason, Min barked a laugh. "What are you doing here?" Rand demanded of the two people he had not expected to see. He took a goblet from one of the serving women while the other hesitated between Min and Olivia. Min won out, perhaps because Olivia's blue dress was playing. Sipping her wine, Min strolled over to Caroline. At a glance from the Carianan woman, Darlin moved away, grinning, and the two women stood with their heads together, whispering. Filled with the power, Rand could catch the occasional word. His name, Darlin's. Wireman Santiago, also a High Lord of Tyr, was not short, and he stood as straight as a sword, yet there was something of a strutting rooster about him. His gray-streaked beard, trimmed to a point and oiled, practically quivered with pride. "Hail to the Lord of the Morning," he said, bowing, or rather he intoned it. Wireman was a great one for intoning and declaiming. "Why am I here, my Lord Dragon?" He sounded puzzled at the question. "Why, when I heard that Dalin was besieged in the stone, what could I do but come to his aid? Burn my soul, I tried to talk some of the others into accompanying me. We'd have put a quick end to Estanda and that lot, I vow." He clutched a fist to demonstrate how he would have crushed the rebels. But only Anayela had the courage. The Karienen were a complete lot of lily hearts. Caroline paused her talk with Min to give him a look that would have had him hunting for the stab wound had he noticed it. Astro pursed his lips and commenced a study of his wine. The High Lady Anayela Naransalona also wore a coat and snug breeches with heeled boots, though she had added a white lace ruff, and her green coat was sewn with pearls. A close cap of pearls sat atop her dark hair. A slim, pretty woman, she offered a simpering curtsy and somehow made it seem she wanted to kiss Rand's hand. Courage was not a word he would have applied to her. Nerve, on the other hand. "My Lord Dragon," she cooed. "I wish we could report complete success, but my master of the horse died fighting the Shonchan, and you left most of my armsmen in Ilion. Still we managed to strike a blow in your name." "Success? A blow?" Alana's scowl took in Wireman and Anayela both before she twisted back around to face Rand. "They landed at the Stone's docks with one ship, but they put most of their armsmen and all the mercenaries they hired in Cairhien ashore from the rest upriver, with orders to enter the city and attack the rebels." She made a sound of disgust. "The only result was a great many men dead, and our negotiations with the rebels thrown back to the beginning." Anayela's simper took on a sickly twist. "My plan was to sortie from the stone and attack them from both sides," Wireman protested. "Darlin refused. Refused!" Darlin was not grinning now. He stood with his feet apart and looked a man who wished he had a sword in his hand rather than a goblet. "I told you then, Wireman, if I stripped the stone of defenders, the rebels would still have outnumbered us badly. Too badly. They've hired every sellsword from the Aranan to the Bay of Ramara." Rand took a chair, flinging one arm over the back. The heavy arms had no supports at the front, so his sword was no problem. Caroline and Min seemed to have switched their talk to clothing. At least, they were fingering each other's coats, and he heard words like backstitch and bias cut, whatever that meant. Alana's gaze drifted between him and Min, and he felt disbelief warring with suspicion along the bond. "I left you two in Cairhien because I wanted you in Cairhien," he said. He trusted neither, but they could cause small harm in Cairhien, where they were outlanders without power. Anger, heated by nausea, entered his voice. "You will make plans to return there as soon as possible. As soon as possible." Anayela's simper grew more sickly, and she cringed slightly. Wireman was made of sterner stuff. "My Lord Dragon, I will serve you where you command, but I can serve best on my native soil. I know these rebels, know where they can be trusted and where—" "As soon as possible," Rand snapped, slamming his fist down on the chair arm hard enough to make the wood creak loudly. "One," Cadswain said, quite clearly and quite incomprehensibly. "I strongly suggest you do as he says, Lord Wireman." Nynaeve eyed Wireman blandly, took a sip of wine. "He has a temper lately, worse than ever, and you don't want it directed at you." Cadswain exhaled a heavy breath. "Stay out of this, girl," she said sharply. Nynaeve glared at her, opened her mouth, then grimaced and closed it again. Gripping her braid, she glided across the carpet to join Min and Caroline. She had gotten very good at gliding. Wireman studied Cadswain for a moment, tilting back his head so he was staring down his nose. "As the Dragon Reborn commands," he said finally, "so does Wireman Santiago obey. My ship can be ready to sail by tomorrow, I wager. Will that suffice?" Rand nodded curtly. It would have to answer. He was not about to waste a moment making a gateway to send this pair of fools where they belong today. "There's hunger in the city," he said, eyeing the golden bear. How many days would that much gold feed Tyr? The thought of food made his stomach clench, and waited for a response that was quick in coming, if not from the direction he expected. "Darlin had cattle and sheep herded down to the city," Caroline said with some considerable warmth. Rand was the one getting the dagger look now. "These days," she faltered for a moment, though the heat never left her gaze. "These days, meat is inedible 2 days after slaughter, so he had the animals brought and wagons full of grain. Estanda and her companions seized it all for themselves." Darlin gave her a fond smile, but his voice was apologetic. "I've tried 3 times, but Estanda is greedy, it seems. I saw no point in continuing to supply my enemies. Your enemies." Rand nodded. At least the man was not ignoring the situation in the city. "There are 2 boys who live outside the walls, Donnie and Com. I don't know any more name than that. About age 10. Once the rebels are settled, and you can leave the stone, I would appreciate it if you found them and kept an eye on them." Min made a sound in her throat, and the bond carried sadness so bleak it almost overwhelmed the burst of love that came with it. So, it must have been death she saw. But she had been wrong about Moraine. Maybe this viewing could be changed by Tavir. "No," Luce Theron growled. "Her viewings must not change. We have to die." Rand ignored him. Darlin appeared puzzled by the request, but he acceded, as what else was he to do when the Dragon Reborn made it? Rand was about to bring up the purpose of his visit when Vera Harkin, another of the Aes Sedai he had sent to Tyr to deal with the rebels, entered the room, frowning over her shoulder as if the maidens had made some difficulty for her. They might well have. The Aiel considered the Aes Sedai sworn to him to be Wise One's apprentices, and maidens took every opportunity to remind apprentices that they were not Wise Ones yet. She was a stocky woman with brown hair cut close around a square face, and despite her green silks, lacking Aes Sedai agelessness, she would have looked a farm wife. A farm wife who ruled her house and farm with a firm hand, though, and would tell a king not to track mud into her kitchen. She was Green Aja, after all, with every scrap of Green Aja pride and haughtiness. She frowned at Olivia, too, with all the disdain of Aes Sedai for Wilder, and that faded only to coolness when she caught sight of Rand. "Well, I must say I shouldn't be surprised to see you, considering what's happened this morning," she said. Unpinning her simple silver cloak brooch, she fastened it to her belt pouch and folded the cloak over her arm. "Though it might have been the news that the others are no more than a day west of the Erin." "The others?" Rand said quietly and steely hard. Vera did not seem impressed. She went on arranging the folds of her cloak. "The other high lords and ladies, of course. Sunaman, Tomaran, all of them. Apparently, they're traveling hot-foot for Tyr as fast as their armsmen's horses can move." Rand leaped up so fast that his sword bound for a moment on the chair arm. Only a moment, because the gilded wood, weakened by his earlier blow, split with a loud crack and the arm dropped to the carpet. He never so much as glanced at it. The fools! The Shonchan at the border with Altara, and they were coming back to Tyr? "Doesn't anybody remember how to obey?" he thundered. "I want messengers sent to them immediately. They're to return to Ilion faster than they left, or I'll have the lot of them hanged." "2," Cadswain said. What in the light was she counting? A bit of advice, boy. Ask her what happened this morning. I smell good news. Vera gave a little start at realizing Cadswain was in the room. Eyeing her sideways, and cautiously, she stopped fiddling with her cloak. We've reached agreement, she said, as if the question had been asked. Tadosian and Simon were wavering as usual, but Herne was nearly as adamant as Estanda. She shook her head. I think Tadosian and Simon might have come around sooner, but some fellows with strange accents have been promising them gold and men. Shan Chan, Nynaeve said. Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking. They might be, Vera allowed. They keep clear of us and look at us like we were mad dogs that might bite any moment. That sounds like what little I've heard of Shan-Chan. In any case, less than an hour gone, Estanda suddenly began asking whether the Lord Dragon would restore her title and lands, and they all collapsed right behind her. The agreement is this. Darlin is accepted as steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn. All laws you made remain unchanged, and they pay for feeding the city for 1 year as a fine for rebellion. In return, they receive full restoration. Darlin is crowned king of Tyr, and they swear fealty to him. Marana and Rathella are preparing the documents for signatures and seals. King? Darlin said incredulously. Caroline swayed over to take his arm. Restoration? Rand growled, hurling his goblet aside in a spray of wine. The bond carried caution, a warning from Min, but he was too angry to pay heed. The sickness twisting his insides twisted his rage, too. Blood and bloody ashes, I stripped them of lands and titles for rebelling against me. They can stay commoners and swear fealty to me. 3, Cadswain said, and Rand's skin popped out in goosebumps an instant before something struck him across the bottom like a hard-swung switch. Vera's lips parted in shock, and the cloak slid off her arm to the floor. Nynaeve laughed. She smothered it quickly, but she laughed. Don't make me have to keep reminding you about manners, boy, Cadswain went on. Alana told me the terms you offered before she left. Darlin is steward, your laws kept, everything else on the table. And it seems they've been met. You can do as you wish, of course, but another piece of advice. When the terms you offer are accepted, hold to them. Else no one will trust you, Lews Theron said, sounding entirely sane for the moment. Rand glared at Cadswain, fists clenched, on the brink of weaving something that would singe her. He could feel a welt on his bottom, and would feel it more in the saddle. It seemed to pulse, and his anger pulsed with it. She peered back calmly over her wine. Was there a hint of challenge in her gaze? Of daring him to channel? The woman spent every moment in his presence challenging him. The trouble was, her advice was good. He had given Alana those terms. He had expected them to bargain harder, gain more, but they had gotten what he actually asked for. More. He had not thought of fines. It seems your fortunes have risen, King Darlin, he said. One of the serving women curtsied and handed Rand another full goblet of wine. Her face was as calm as any Aes Sedai's. You might have thought men arguing with sisters was a matter of every day with her. All hail King Darlin, Wireman intoned, sounding half strangled, and after a moment, Aniela echoed him, as breathless as if she had run a mile. Once she had talked of herself for a crown in Tyr. But why would they want me as king? Darlin said, scrubbing a hand through his hair. Or anyone. There have been no kings in the stone since Morina died 1,000 years ago. Or did you demand that, Vera Sedai? Vera straightened from picking up her cloak and began shaking it out. It was their demand would be too strong. Their suggestion. Any of them would have leapt at the chance of a throne, especially Estanda. Aniela made a choking sound. But of course they knew there was no hope of that. This way they can swear to you instead of to the dragon reborn, making it slightly less distasteful. And if you are king, Caroline put in, it means that steward in tears to the Lord Dragon becomes a lesser title. She laughed throatily. They may even tack on 3 or 4 more noble-sounding titles to try pushing it down to its dignity. Vera pursed her lips as though she had been about to bring up that very point. And would you marry a king, Caroline? Darlin asked. I'll accept the crown if you will, though I'll have to have a crown made. Min cleared her throat. I can tell you how it should look if you like. Caroline laughed again and released Darlin's arm, swaying away from him. I will have to see you in it before I could answer that. Have Min's crown made. And if it makes you look pretty, she smiled, then perhaps I will consider it. I wish you both the best, Rand said curtly, but there are more important matters to go into right now. Min gave him a sharp look, disapproval flooding the bond. Nynaeve gave him a sharp look. What was that about? You will accept that crown, darling, and as soon as those documents are signed, I want you to arrest those Seanchan. Then gather every man in Tyr who knows one end of sword or halberd from the other. I'll arrange for Ashaman to take you to Arad Daman. And me, my lord dragon? Wireman asked avidly. He all but quivered with eagerness, managing to strut while standing still. If there is fighting to be done, I can serve you better there than languishing in Cairhien. Rand studied the man, and Aniella. Wireman was a bungling idiot, and he trusted neither, but he could not see what harm they could do with no more than a handful of followers. Very well, you two may accompany the High Lord, that is, King Darlin. Aniella gulped as though she, for one, would rather return to Cairhien. But what am I supposed to do in Arad Daman? Darlin wanted to know. The little I've heard of that land, it's a madhouse. Luce Theron laughed wildly in Rand's head. Tarmon Gaiden is coming soon, Rand said. The light sent not too soon. You are going to Arad Daman to get ready for Tarmon Gaiden.
Chapter 22. To make an anchor weep. Despite the pitching induced by the long blue rollers, Harina din Togara sat very straight alongside her sister, just ahead of their parasol bearers and the steersman of his long tiller. Shallan seemed intent on studying the 12 men and women working the oars, or perhaps she was deep in thought. There was plenty to think on of late, not least this meeting Harina had been summoned to, but she let her thoughts drift blindly, composing herself. Every time the first 12 of the Atha An'Mier met since she had attained Ilium, she had needed to compose herself before attending. When she reached Tyr and found Zaida's blue gull still anchored in the river, she had been sure the woman was in Caemlyn yet, or at least trailing far behind her own wake. A painful mistake, that. Though in truth, very little would have been altered had Zaida been weeks behind. Not for Harina, at least. No. No thoughts of Zaida. The sun stood only a fist above the horizon in the east, and several vessels of the shorebound were making for the long breakwater that guarded Ilium's harbor. One carried 3 masts and a semblance of a high rig, all the major sails square, yet he was squat and ill-handled, wallowing through the low, rolling seas in fountains of spray rather than slicing them. Most were small and low-rigged, their triangular sails nearly all high-boomed. Some seemed quick enough, but since the shorebound seldom sailed beyond sight of land and usually anchored at night for fear of shoals, their quickness availed them little. Cargo that required true speed went to Atha An'Mier ships, at a premium price, to be sure. It was a small portion of what Atha An'Mier carried, in part because of the price, in part because few things actually required their speed. Besides, cargo hire guaranteed some profit, but when the cargo master traded on his own for the ship, all of the profit went to vessel and clan. As far as the eye could see, to east and west along the coastline, Atha An'Mier ships lay at anchor, rakers and skimmers, soarers and darters, most surrounded by bumboats so cluttered they looked like drunken shore festivals. Rowed out from the city, the bumboats offered for sale everything from dried fruit to quartered beeves and sheep, from iron nails and iron stock to swords and daggers, from gaudy trinkets of Ilion that might catch a deckhand's eye to gold and gems, though the gold was usually a thin plate that wore off in a few months to show the brass beneath, and the gems colored glass. They brought rats, too, if not for sale. Anchored so long, every ship was plagued by rats now. Rats and spoilage made sure there was always a market for the peddlers. Bumboats also surrounded the massive Shongshan-built vessels, dozens upon dozens of them that had been used in the escape. That was what it was being called now, the Great Escape from Ebu Dar. Say the escape, and no one asked what escape he meant. Great bluff-bowed things they were, twice the beam of a raker and more, some, suitable for battering through heavy seas, perhaps, but strangely rigged, and with odd ribbed sails too stiff for proper setting. Men and women were swarming over those masts and yards now, altering the rigging to something more usable. No one wanted the craft, but the shipyards would require years to replace all of the vessels lost at Ebu Dar, and the expense. Overly beany or not, those ships would see many years of use. No sailmistress had any desire to sink into debt, borrowing from the clan coffers, when most, if not all, of her own gold was being salvaged by the Shongshan in Ebu Dar, not unless she had no other choice. Some, unlucky enough to have neither their own ships nor one of the Shongshans, did have no other choice. Pt.12 passed the heavy wall of the breakwater, thick with dark slime and long hairy weed that the breakers crashing against the grey stone failed to dislodge, and the broad grey-green harbor of Ilion opened up before her, ringed with deep expanses of marsh, just turning from winter brown to green in patches where long-legged birds waded.
I'll be right back.
A line of mist drifted across the boat on a gentle breeze, dampening her hair before it passed on up the harbor. Small fishing boats were pulling their nets along the edges of the marsh, a dozen sorts of gull and tern wheeling overhead to steal what they could. The city did not interest her beyond the long stone docks, lined with trading craft, but the harbor. That broad, nearly circular expanse of water was the greatest anchorage known, and filled with shipping and river craft, most waiting their turn at the docks. It truly was filled by hundreds of vessels in every shape and size, and not all of those ships belonged to the shorebound. There were only rakers here, those slender three-masters that could race porpoises. Rakers and three of the ungainly Shongshan monstrosities. They were the vessels of wave mistresses and of sail mistresses who formed the first 12 of each clan, those that could be fitted into the harbor before there was no more room. Even Ilion's anchorage had its limits, and the Council of Nine, not to mention the steward in Ilion for the Dragon Reborn, would have made trouble had the Atha'anmier begun crowding their trade. Abruptly, a strong, icy wind came up out of the north. No, it did not come up. It just suddenly was there full strength, whipping the harbor to choppy whitecaps, and carrying a smell of pines and something earthy. She knew little of trees, but much of timbers used in building ships, though she did not think there were many pines anywhere near to Ilion. Then she noticed the mist line. While ships rocked and pitched under that southerly blast, the mist continued its slow drift northward. Keeping her hands on her knees required effort. She wanted very much to wipe the dampness out of her hair. She had thought after Shadar Logoth that nothing ever would shake her again, but she had seen too many oddities of late, oddities that spoke of the world twisting. As abruptly as it had come, the wind was gone. Murmurs rose, the stroke faltered, and the number 4 port oar caught a crab, splashing water into the boat. The crew knew winds did not behave that way. "Steady there," Harina said firmly. "Steady." "Give way together, you shore-bound rag-pickers!" her deck mistress shouted from the bows. Lean and leathery, Jadine had leather lungs as well. "Do I need to call the stroke for you?" The twin insults tightened some faces in anger, others in chagrin, but the oars began moving smoothly again. Shallan was studying the mist now. Asking what she saw, what she thought, would have to wait. Harina was not sure she wanted the answer heard by any of her crew. They had seen enough to have them frightened already. The steersman turned the 12 toward one of the bulky Shongshan ships, where any bumboat that ventured near was being chased away before the peddler could get out 2 words. It was one of the largest of them, with a towering stern castle that had 3 levels. 3! And the thing actually had a pair of balconies across the stern. She would not care to see what a following sea driven by a Samaros or one of the Arith Ocean's Sohins would do to those. Other 12s and a few 8s waited their turn to sidle up to the vessel in the order of precedence of their passengers. Jadine stood up in the bow and bellowed, "Showdine!" Her voice carried well, and the 12 that was approaching the ship circled away. The others continued their waiting. Harina did not stand until the crew had backed oars and drawn them in on the starboard, bringing the 12 to a smooth halt right where Jadine could catch a dangling line and hold the small craft alongside the larger. Shallan sighed. "Courage, sister," Harina told her. "We have survived Shadar Logoth. Though the light helped me, I am unsure what we survived." She barked a laugh. "More than that, we survived Cadswain Malydrin, and I doubt anyone else here could do that." Shallan smiled weakly, but at least she smiled. Harina scrambled up the rope ladder as easily as she could have 20 years before, and was piped aboard by the deckmaster, a squat fellow with a fresh scar running under the leather patch that covered where his right eye had been. Many had taken wounds in the escape. Many had died. Even the deck of this ship felt strange beneath her bare feet, the planking laid in an odd pattern. The side was manned properly, however. 12 bare-chested men to her left, 12 women in bright linen blouses to her right, all bowing till they were looking straight down at the deck. She waited for Shallan and the parasol-bearers to join her before starting forward. The vessel's sailmistress and wind-finder at the end of the rows bowed less deeply, while touching heart lips and forehead. Both wore waist-long white mourning stoles that all but hid their many necklaces, as did she and Shallan. "The welcome of my ship to you, Wave Mistress," the sailmistress said, sniffing her scent-box. "And the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks. The others await you in the great cabin." "The grace of the light be upon you also," Harina replied. Touraine, in blue silk trousers and a red silk blouse, was stocky enough to make her wind-finder, surreal, look slender rather than average, and she had a gimlet eye and a sour twist to her mouth. But neither those nor the sniffing was meant for discourtesy. Touraine was not that bold. The gaze was the same she gave everyone. Her own vessel lay at the bottom of the harbor at Ebu Dar, and the harbor did stink after the clean air of the open salt. The great cabin ran nearly the whole length of the tall stern castle, a space clear of any furniture save for 13 chairs and a table against the bulkhead that held tall-necked wine pitchers and goblets of yellow porcelain, and 24 women in brocaded silks could not come near filling it. She was the last of the first 12 of the Ata-Annier to arrive, and the reaction to her among the other wave mistresses was what she had come to expect. Lincora and Waline turned their backs very deliberately. Round-faced Niala gave her a scowl, then stalked over to refill her goblet. Lasine, so slender that her bosom seemed immense, shook her head, as if wondering at Harina's presence. Others went on chatting as if she were not there. All wore the mourning stoles, of course. Helena strode across the deck to her, the long pink scar down the right side of her square face giving her a dangerous look. Her tightly curled hair was nearly all gray, the honor chain across her left cheek heavy with gold medallions recording her triumphs, including one for her part in the escape. Her wrists and ankles still bore the marks of Shongshan chains, though hidden by her silks now. "I hope you are quite recovered, Harina the Light-Willing," she said, tilting her head to one side and clasping her plump, tattooed hands in mock sympathy. "Not still sitting tender, are you? I put a cushion on your chair, just in case." She laughed uproariously, looking to her wind-finder, but Kyra gave her a blank look, as if she had not heard, then added a faint laugh. Helena frowned. When she laughed at anything, she expected those under her to laugh as well. The stately wind-finder had her own worries, however. A daughter missing among the shore-bound, abducted by Aes Sedai. There would be repayment for that. One did not need to like Kyra or Polana to know that was necessary. Harina favored the pair with a tight smile and brushed by Polana closely enough that the woman had to step back or have her feet trodden on, scowling as she did. Daughter of the sands, Harina thought sourly. Morale's approach brought a genuine smile, however. The tall, slender woman, her shoulder-length hair as much white as black, had been her friend since they began as deckhands together on an aging raker with an iron-handed sail mistress embittered by her lack of prospects. Learning that Morale had escaped Ebudar and unharmed had been a joy. She favored Polana and Kyra with a frown. To Brayla, her wind-finder also grimaced at the pair, but unlike them, it was not because Morale demanded wrist-licking. Sisters, Tabrela and Kyra shared a deep concern for Talan, Kyra's daughter. Yet beyond that, either would have slit the other's throat for a copper. Or better, in their view, seen her sister reduced to cleaning the bilges. There was no hatred deeper than hatred between siblings. Don't let those mud ducks peck at you, Harina. Morale's voice was deep for a woman, but melodious. She handed Harina one of the 2 goblets she carried. You did what you felt you had to do, and the light willing, all will come right. Against her will, Harina's eyes went to the ring bolt set in one of the beams of the overhead. It could have been removed by now. She was sure it remained for the purpose of provoking her. That strange young woman, Min, had been right. Her bargain with the Koramor had been judged deficient, giving away too much and demanding too little in return. In this same cabin with the rest of the first 12 and the new mistress of the ships watching, she had been stripped and hung by her ankles from that ring bolt, stretched tight to another set in the deck, and strapped until she howled her lungs out. The welts and bruises had faded, but the memory lingered however hard she tried to suppress it. Not howls for mercy or respite, though. Never that. Else she would have had no alternative to stepping aside, becoming just a sail mistress again, while someone else was chosen wave mistress of Clan Showdine. Most of the women in this room believed she should have done so anyway after such a punishment, perhaps even Morale. But she had the other part of Min's foretelling to bolster her courage. She would be mistress of the ships one day. In law, the first 12 of the Ata Anmier could choose any sail mistress as mistress of the ships, yet only 5 times in more than 3,000 years had they reached outside their own number. The Aes Sedai said Min's peculiar visions always came true, but she did not intend to gamble. All will come right, Morale. The light willing, she said. Eventually. She just had to have the courage to ride out whatever came before. As usual, Zyda arrived without ceremony, striding in, followed by Shylin, her wind-finder, tall and slim and reserved, and Amelia, the bosomy, pale-haired Aes Sedai Zyda had brought back with her from Camelin. Ageless face seemingly permanently surprised, her startling blue eyes very wide, the Aes Sedai was breathing heavily for some reason. Everyone bowed, but Zyda paid the courtesies no heed. In green brocades and white mourning stole, she was short, with a close cap of graying curls, yet she managed to make herself seem every bit as tall as Shylin. A matter of presence, Serena had to admit. Zyda had that, and a coolness of thought that being caught by a Samaras on a lee shore could not shake. In addition to returning with the first of the Aes Sedai agreed to in the bargain for use of the Bowl of the Winds, she also had returned with her own bargain, for land in Andor under Atan Nier law, and where Harina's bargain had been judged wanting, Zyda's had found great favor. That and the fact that she had come straight to Ilion via one of those peculiar gateways woven by her own wind-finder were not the only reasons that she was now mistress of the ships, but neither had hurt her cause. Harina herself thought this traveling overrated. Shallan could make a gateway now, but making one to the deck of a ship without causing damage, even on still waters like these, especially from the deck of another ship, was chancy at best, and no one could make one large enough to sail a ship through. Very overrated. The man has not arrived yet, Zaida announced, taking the chair with its back to the large stern windows and arranging her long, fringed red sash just so, adjusting the angle of the emerald-studded dagger thrust through the sash. She was a very particular woman. It was natural enough to want everything in its place on board a ship. Tidiness became a habit as well as a necessity, yet she was exacting even by the usual standards. The remaining chairs, none fastened to the deck in proper fashion, made two rows facing each other, and the wave mistresses began taking their seats, each woman's wind finder standing behind her chair. It appears he intends us to wait on him. Amelia, see that the goblets are all filled. Ah, it seems the woman had put her foot wrong yet again. Amelia jumped, then gathered her bronze-colored skirts to her knees and went racing for the table where the wine pitchers sat. Badly wrong, it appeared. Harina wondered how long Zaida would continue to allow her to wear dresses rather than trousers, which were much more practical shipboard. It would surely be a shock to her when they passed beyond sight of land and blouses were abandoned. Of the brown Aja, Amelia had wanted to study the Afa Annier, but she was given little time for study. Her purpose was to work, and Zaida saw that she did. She was there to teach the wind-finders all that the Aes Sedai knew. She still dithered over that, but shore-bound instructors, rare as they were, ranked barely a whisker above the deckhands. In the beginning, the woman apparently had believed her dignity fully equal to Zaida's, if not more, and the deck-master's flail, laid with some frequent regularity across her rump, supposedly was changing her mind, if slowly. Amelia had actually tried to desert 3 times. Strangely, she did not know how to make a gateway, knowledge that carefully was being kept from her, and she should have known she was being watched too closely to bribe her way onto a bumboat. Well, she was unlikely to try again. Reportedly, she'd been told that a fourth attempt would earn a public strapping this time, followed by being hung by her ankles in the rigging. No one would risk that shame, surely. Sail mistresses and even wave mistresses had been reduced to deckhands and gone willingly after that, eager to lose themselves and their disgrace in the mass of men and women hauling lines and handling sail. Removing the cushion from the seat of her chair and dropping it disdainfully on the deck, Harina took her place at the bottom of the left-hand row, Shallon at her back. She was the least senior except for Moreo, seated across from her. But then Zaida would have sat only one chair farther up had she not gained the 6th fat golden earring for each ear and the chains that connected them. Her lobes might still be sore from the piercings. A pleasant thought. As he makes us wait, perhaps we should make him wait when he finally does appear. With an untouched goblet in hand, she waved away the anxious Aes Sedai, who scurried over to Moreo. Foolish woman. Did she not know she should have served the mistress of the ships first, and then followed with the wave mistresses by seniority? Zaida toyed with her piercework scent box, hanging on a very heavy golden chain around her neck. She wore a wide, close-fitting collar of heavy gold links, too, a gift from Elaine of Andor. He comes from the Cormor, she said dryly, whom you were supposed to stick to like a barnacle. Her voice never hardened, but every word cut at Harina. This man will be as close as I can come to speaking to the Cormor without dire need, since you agreed he did not have to attend me more than 3 times in any period of 2 years. Because of you, I must accept this man's discourtesy if he turns out to be a scabrous drunkard who must run to the rail and empty his stomach every second sentence. The ambassador I send to the Cormor will be someone who knows how to obey her orders. Helena tittered and smirked. She thought everyone was like herself. Shallon squeezed Harina's shoulder reassuringly, but she did not need it. Stay with the Cormor? There was no way she could explain to anyone, even Shallon, Cadswain's rude methods of enforcing her will, or her total lack of respect for Harina's dignity. She had been an ambassador from the Afa Annier in name, and forced to dance to any tune the Aes Sedai piped. She was willing to admit, if only to herself, that she'd almost wept with relief when she realized that cursed woman was going to let her leave. Besides, that girl's visions always came true. So the Aes Sedai
Hey,
said,
Fire, how you
and they could
doing?
not lie. It was enough. Touraine slipped into the cabin and bowed to Zaida. The Coromor's emissary has arrived, shipmistress. He he stepped out of a gateway on the quarterdeck. That created murmurs among the wind-finders, and Amelia jerked as though she had felt the deckmaster's flail again. I hope he did not damage your deck too badly, Touraine, Zaida said. Harina sipped wine to hide her small smile. Apparently the man was to be made to wait a little at least. Not at all, shipmistress. Touraine sounded surprised. The gateway opened a good foot above the deck, and he stepped through from one of the city's docks. Yes, Shallan whispered. I can see how to do that. She thought anything to do with the power was wonderful. That must have been a shock, seeing a stone dock above your quarterdeck, Zaida said. Very well. I will see whether the Cormor has sent me a scabrous drunkard. Send him in, Touraine, but do not rush. Amelia, am I to get any wine before nightfall? The Aes Sedai gasped, and making little whimpers as if on the point of tears, rushed to fetch a goblet as Touraine bowed and left. Light! What had Amelia done? Long moments passed, and Zaida had her wine well before a large man with dark hair curling to his broad shoulders entered the cabin. He certainly was not scabrous, nor did he appear drunk. The high collar of his black coat held a silver pin in the shape of a sword on one side, and on the other a red and gold pin shaped like one of the creatures that entwined the Coromor's forearms. A dragon. Yes, that was what it was called. A round pin fastened to his left shoulder showed 3 golden crowns against blue enamel. A sigil, perhaps? Was he a shore-bound noble? And Coromor actually had done Zaida honor in sending this sword? Knowing Rand al'Thor as she did, she doubted it had been intentional. It was not that he tried to dishonor anyone, yet he cared little for the honors of others. He bowed to Zaida, handling the sword at his side smoothly, but he failed to touch heart and lips and forehead. Still, some shortcomings had to be overlooked with the shorebound. I apologize if I arrived late, shipmistress, he said, but it seemed unnecessary to come before all of your number were here. He must have a very good-looking bloke, so he whirled back from the dock. Studying him up and down with a frown, Zaida sipped her wine. You have a name? I'm Logain, he said simply. Half the women in the room exhaled sharply, and most of the rest let their jaws drop. More than one slopped wine from her goblet. Not Zaida, and not Harina, but the others. Logain. That was a name known even to the Afa-Unmier. May I speak, shipmistress? Amelia asked breathily. She was clutching the porcelain pitcher so hard that Harina feared it might shatter in her hands, but the woman had learned enough sense to say no more until Zaida nodded. Then words spilled from her in a breathless rush. This man was a false dragon. He was gentled for it. How it is he can channel again, I cannot know, but he channels Saidin. Saidin! He is tainted, shipmistress. If you deal with him, you will incur the wrath of the White Tower. I know enough, Zaida cut in. You should be well aware by now how much I fear the wrath of the White Tower. But Zaida held up a single finger, and the Aes mouth snapped shut, her lips twisting in a sickly fashion. That one word might lead to her kissing the deckmaster's sister again, and she knew it. What she says is true in part, Logain said calmly. I am an Usherman, but there is no taint any longer. Saidin is clean. The Creator decided to show us mercy, it seems. I have a question for her. Whom do you serve, Aes Sedai? Egwene Al'Vir or Elida Arroyhan? Wisely, Amelia kept her mouth shut. For the next year, she serves me, Loghain, Zaida said firmly. The Aes Sedai squeezed her pale eyes shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were even wider than before, impossible as that seemed, and they held a look of horror. Was it possible she had believed Zaida might relent and let her go early? You can confine your questions to me, the shipmistress went on. But first I have two for you. Where is the Cormor? I must send an ambassador to him, and he must keep her close in accordance with the bargain. Remind him of that. And what message do you bring from him? A request for some service, I suppose. As to where he is, I cannot say. The man smiled slightly, as if he had made a joke. He smiled. I demand, Zaida began, but he cut her off, provoking angry mutters and hot glares from the other women. The fool seemed to think he was an equal to the mistress of the ships. He wants his whereabouts kept secret for now, shipmistress. The Forsaken have made efforts to kill him. I am willing to take Karina din Togara with me, however. From what I heard, I think he found her acceptable. Karina jerked so hard she spilled wine over the back of her hand, then took another long swallow. But no, Zaida would divorce Amel and marry a ballast stone before she sent Karina din Togara as her ambassador. Still, even the thought of it was enough to make her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. Even becoming mistress of the ships might be insufficient recompense for being forced to endure cadswain any longer. Studying Loghain with a stony face, Zaida told Amelia to pour wine for him. The Aes Sedai flinched, and by the time she reached the table she was trembling so hard that the pitcher's spout clattered on the rim of the goblet. Almost as much wine went onto the deck as inside the goblet. Strangely, Loghain walked over to her and put his hands on hers to steady her. Was he one of those who could not leave others to do their own work? You've nothing to fear from me, Amelia Sedai, he told her. It's been a long time since I ate anyone for breakfast. She stared up at him with her mouth hanging open as though uncertain whether he was making a joke. And the service he requests? Zaida said. Not a request, shipmistress. He had to straighten the pitcher to keep the goblet from overflowing. Taking the goblet, he stepped away from Amelia, but she stood gaping at his back. Right, but the woman found no end of ways to get into trouble. A call on your side of the bargain with the Cormor. Among other things, you promised him ships, and he needs ships to carry food and other supplies to Bandar Eben from Ilion and Tyr. That can be done, Zaida said, not quite masking her relief, though she shot a frown at Harina. Helena glared as well, of course, but so did Lasine and Niola and several others. Harina suppressed a sigh. Some of the details of the bargain were quite onerous, she had to admit, such as the requirement that the mistress of the ships be prepared to attend him up to 3 times in any 2 years. The Jendai prophecy said the Atha Amnier were to serve the Coromor, yet few opinions of how they were to serve included the mistress of the ships going running when he called. But the others had not been there, bargaining with Aes Sedai, convinced that she had no alternative to making whatever bargain she could. Truth of the light, it was a wonder she had gotten as much as she had. Supplies for more than 1 million people, shipmistress, Loghain added as casually as if he were asking for another goblet of wine. How many more I cannot say, but Bandar Eben itself is starving. The ships must arrive as soon as possible. Shock rippled through the cabin. Harina was not alone in taking a long drink of wine. Even Zaida's eyes widened in amazement. That might require more rakers than we possess, she said at last, unable to keep the incredulity from her voice. Loghain shrugged as though that were of no account. Even so, that is what he requires of you. Use other ships if you must. Zaida stiffened in her chair. Required. Bargain or no bargain, that was imprudent language to use with her. Touraine slipped into the cabin again, and in breach of all protocol, ran to Zaida, her bare feet slapping the deck. Bending close, she whispered into the shipmistress's ear. Zaida's face slowly took on a look of horror. She half raised her scent box, then shuddered and let it fall to her bosom. "Send her in," she said. "Send her in immediately. There is news to make an anchor weep," she went on, as Touraine raced from the cabin. "I will let you hear it from she who brought it. You must wait," she added when Logain opened his mouth. "You must wait." He had sufficient sense to hold his peace, but not enough to hide his impatience, stalking to the side of the cabin to stand with his mouth tight and his brows drawn down. The young woman who entered and bowed deeply to Zaida was tall and lean, and she might have been lovely, except that her face was haggard. Her blue linen blouse and green trousers looked as if they'd been worn for days, and she swayed on her feet with weariness. Her honor chain held only a handful of medallions, as befitted her youth, yet Harina could see that no fewer than 3 commended acts of great courage. "I am Sumela din Salan Long Eyes, shipmistress," she said hoarsely. "Sail mistress of the Darter, wind racer. I sailed as fast as I could, but I fear it is too late for anything to be done. I stopped at every island between Tremalking and here, but I was always too late." Tears began to trickle down her cheeks, yet she seemed unaware of them. "Tell the first 12 your sad news in your own way, at your own pace," Zaida said gently. "Amelia, give her wine." Not gently said at all. The Aes Sedai leaped to obey. "Almost 3 weeks ago," Samela said, "Amayar on Tremalkin began asking the gift of passage to every island. Always a man and a woman to each island. Those who asked for Isla Somera requested they be put off in boats out of sight of land when they were told that the Shonshan holds all of Somera." She took a full goblet from Amelia, nodding her thanks, then drank deeply. Harina exchanged questioning glances with Morail, who shook her head slightly. No Amayar had ever requested the gift of passage in Harina's memory, though for them it truly was a gift, with no gift expected in return. And they avoided the salt, keeping their small fishing boats close to shore. So asking to be put off out of sight of land was as strange as asking passage. But what could be so dire in this? All of the Amayar in the ports left, even those owed money from the shipyards or the rope walks, but no one thought anything of it for 2 or 3 days. The wine had not wet Samela's throat enough to mitigate her hoarseness. She scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Not until we realized none had come back. The governor sent people to the Amayar villages, and they found," she squeezed her eyes shut, "the Amayar were all dead or dying. Men, women," her voice broke, "children." Funeral keening rose in the cabin, and Harina was surprised to realize that shrill sound was coming from her mouth, too. Sad enough to make an anchor weep? This should make the heavens sob. No wonder the sail mistress was hoarse. How many hours, how many days had she cried since learning of this catastrophe? "How?" Helena demanded when the keening died. Face distraught, she leaned forward in her chair. She was holding her scent box to her nose as if the scent could somehow ward off the stench of this news. "Some sickness? Speak, woman."
My day wasn't
"Poison,
too bad,
brave
Fire.
mistress," Samela
Can't
replied.
complain too much.
She struggled to compose herself, but tears still leaked down her face. "Everywhere I have been it was the same. They gave their children a poison that put them into a deep sleep from which they did not waken. It seems there was not enough of that to go around. So many of the adults took slower poison. Some lived long enough to be found and tell the tale. The great hand on Tremalking melted. The hill where it stood reportedly is now a deep hollow. It seems the Amayar had prophecies that spoke of the hand, and when it was destroyed they believed this signaled the end of time, what they called the end of illusion. They believed it was time for them to leave this illusion." She laughed the word bitterly. "We call the world." "Have none been saved?" Zaida asked. "None at all?" Tears glistened on her cheeks, too, but Harina could not fault her on that. Her own cheeks were wet. "None, shipmistress." Zaida stood, and tears or no tears, she held the aura of command, and her voice was steady. The fastest ships must be sent to every island, even to those of Isla Sonera. A way must be found. When the salt first stilled after the breaking, the
I'll be
Amayar
right back.
lost our protection from brigands and raiders, and we owe them protection still. If we can find only a handful who still live, we still owe it. This is as sad a story as I have ever heard. Loghain's voice sounded too loud as he walked back out in front of Zaida. But your ships are committed to Bandar Eben. If you don't have enough rakers, then you must use your other fast ships too. All of them, if necessary. Are you mad? As well as heartless? Zaida demanded. Fists on her hips and feet apart, she seemed to be standing on a quarterdeck. Her glare stabbed at Loghain. We must mourn. We must save who we can, and mourn for the countless thousands we cannot save. She might as well have smiled for all the effect her glares had on Loghain. As he spoke, it seemed to Harina that the space turned chill and the light dimmed. She was not the only woman to hug herself against that cold. Mourn if you must, he said, but mourn on the march for Tarmangaiden. Chapter 23. Call to a Sitting. With Magla and Salita out for the morning, Ramonda had the patched brown tent to herself, a blessed opportunity to read, though the two mismatched brass lamps on the small table gave off a faint yet nose-wrinkling scent of rancid oil. One had to live with such things these days. Some might consider the flame, the blade, and the heart unseemly for one of her attainments and position. As a girl in Farmading, she had been forbidden such books, but it made an agreeable change from dry histories and terrifying reports of food spoilage. She had seen a side of beef kept for months as fresh as the day the cow was slaughtered, but now the keepings were failing one by one. Some had taken to muttering that there must be a flaw in Egwene's creation, yet that was arrant blather. If a weave worked once, then properly done it always worked, barring something to disrupt the weave, and Egwene's new weaves always worked as claimed. She had to give the woman that. And try as they might, and they had tried very hard, no one could detect any interference. It was as if Sidar itself were failing. It was unthinkable and inescapable. Worst of all, no one could think of anything to do. She certainly could not. A brief interlude with tales of romance and adventure was much preferable to contemplating utter futility and the failure of what was by its very nature unfailing. The novice straightening the tent had sense enough not to comment on her reading, or to glance at the wood-bound book twice. Bodawin Coffin was quite pretty, but she was an intelligent girl even so, though she had something of her brother around the eyes, and rather more of him in her head than she was willing to admit. Undoubtedly, she was already hard on the path to the green, or perhaps the blue. The girl wanted to live adventure, not just read about it, as if an Aes Sedai's life would not bring her more adventure than she wished without searching for it. Ramonda felt no regret over the girl's path. The yellow would have plenty to choose from among more suitable novices. There could be no question of accepting any of the older women, of course, yet that left a wealth of choice. She tried to focus on the page. She did enjoy the story of Birgitta and Geidel King. The tent was not particularly large, and was quite crowded. It held a trio of hard canvas cots, barely softened by thin mattresses stuffed with lumpy wool, 3 ladder-back chairs made by distinctly different hands, a rickety washstand with a cracked mirror and a chipped blue pitcher standing in the white basin, and along the table, made steady by a small block of wood under one leg, brass-bound chests for clothing, bed linens, and personal possessions. As a sitter, she could have had the space to herself, but she liked being able to keep a close eye on Magla and Salita. Just because they all sat for the yellow was no reason to trust too far. Magla supposedly was her ally in the hall, yet went her own way much too often, and Salita seldom did anything else. Still, it made for inconvenience aside from crowding. Bodawin had a great deal of work, mainly putting away the dresses and slippers Solita scattered across the tattered carpets after deciding they would not do. That woman was frivolous enough for a green. She went through her entire wardrobe every single morning. Likely she thought Ramonda would have her serving woman straightened. She always seemed to think Aelmara was as much in her service as Ramonda's. But Aelmara had served Ramonda for years before she went into retirement, not to mention helping her escape Farmadding after a slight misunderstanding a short time later. There was no possibility she would require Aelmara to look after another sister as well as herself. She frowned at the book, not seeing a word. Why in the light had Magla insisted on Salita back in Saladar? In truth, Magla had bandied several names about, each more ridiculous than the last, but had settled on Salita once she decided the plump tyrant had the best chance of being raised to a chair. Romanda had thrown her own support behind Dagdara, a far more suitable candidate, not to mention one she thought she could sway without too much difficulty. Yet she herself had been trying for a chair while Magla already held one. That carried weight. And no matter that Ramanda had previously held a chair longer than anyone in living memory, well, it was done, and that was that. What could not be cured must be endured. Nisao ducked into the tent, the light of Sidar around her winking out as she did so. In the brief instant before the tent flap fell shut, Saren, her bald-headed stump of a warder, was visible outside, a hand resting on his sword hilt, and his head swiveling, plainly standing guard. "May I speak with you alone?" the diminutive sister said. Short enough to make Saren seem tall, she always minded Ramanda of a large-eyed sparrow. There was nothing tiny about her powers of observation or her intellect, however. She had been a natural choice for the council the Ajas created to try keeping an eye on Egwene, and it was certainly no fault of hers that said council had had little or no restraining effect on the woman. "Of course, Nisao." Romanda casually closed the book and moved up to tuck it beneath the yellow-tasseled cushion on her chair. It would never do to have word get around that she was reading that. "It must be almost time for your next class, Bodawin. You don't want to be late." "Oh no, Aes Sedai. Sharina would be very upset." Spreading her white skirts in a deep curtsy, the novice darted from the tent. Ramonda compressed her lips. Sharina would be upset. That woman was emblematic of all that was wrong with allowing those above 18 into the novice ranks. Her potential was beyond incredible, but that was beside the point. Sharina Malloy was a disruption. How to be rid of her? Her and all the other women too old to have had their names written in the novice book in the first place. Provisions were strictly limited for putting a woman out once her name was in the book. Unfortunately, over the years, a number of women had been found to have lied about their age to gain entrance to the tower. By a few years only in most cases, but allowing them to remain had set precedents, and Egwene Alvear had set another, and much worse. There had to be some way to overcome it. "May I make us private?" Nisao asked. "If you wish. Have you learned something about the negotiations?" Despite Egwene's capture, talks continued under the pavilion at the foot of the bridge in Darine, or rather, the semblance of talks. They were a farce, a dumb show of obstinacy, yet it was necessary to keep a close eye on the negotiators. Varylin had snatched most of that work to herself, claiming Grey Aja prerogative. But Magla found ways to wriggle into the matter whenever she could, and so did Soroya and Takima and Faisella. Worse than the fact that none of them seemed to trust the others to carry out the negotiations, or much at all, for that matter. At times, all of them almost seemed to be negotiating for Elida. Well, perhaps it was not that bad. They held fast against the woman's ridiculous demand that the Blue Aja be dissolved, and argued, if not nearly with sufficient force, for Elida stepping down. But if she, and Lilane, she was forced to admit, did not stiffen their backbones now and then, they might well accede to some of Elida's other odious conditions. Right. At times it was as if they had forgotten the entire purpose of marching on Tar Valon. "Pour us tea," she went on, gesturing to a painted wooden tray sitting atop two stacked chests that held a silver pitcher and several battered pewter cups. "And tell me what you've heard." The glow surrounded Nisao briefly while she warded the tent and tied off the weave. I know nothing of the negotiations, she said, filling two of the cups. I want to ask you to speak to Lelaine. Romonda took the proffered cup and used taking a slow swallow to give herself time for thought. At least this tea had not yet turned. Lelaine? What could there be about Lelaine that required warding? Still, anything that gave her leverage against the other woman would be useful. Lelaine seemed entirely too smug of late for her to be entirely comfortable about it. She shifted on the seat cushion. Regarding what? Why don't you speak to her yourself? We haven't fallen as low as it seems the White Tower has under Elida. I have spoken to her. Or rather, she has spoken to me, and rather forcefully. Nisao sat down and set her cup on the table while she arranged her yellow-slashed skirts with overly elaborate care. She wore a small frown. It seemed she was fiddling for time, too. Lelaine demanded that I stop asking questions about Anaya and Chiron, she said finally. According to her, their murders are Blue Aja business. Romanda snorted, shifting again. The book's wooden cover was a hard lump beneath her, its corners digging into her hip. That is utter nonsense. But why were you asking questions? I don't recall you being inquisitive about such matters. The other woman touched her cup to her lips, but if she drank, it was the tiniest sip. Lowering the cup, she almost seemed to grow taller. She sat up so straight. A sparrow becoming a hawk. Because the mother ordered me to. Ramada kept her eyebrows from rising only with an effort. So, in the beginning, she had accepted Egwene for the same reason she suspected every other sitter had. Certainly Lelaine had done so, once she realized she could not attain the stolen staff herself. A malleable young girl would be a puppet in the hands of the Hall, and Ramada had fully intended to be the one pulling her strings. Later it had seemed obvious that Swan was the true puppeteer, and there had been no way to stop her short of rebelling against a second Amelin, which surely would have shattered the rebellion against Elida. She hoped Lelaine had ground her teeth over that half as much as she had. Now Egwene was in Elida's hands, yet in several meetings she had remained cool and collected, determined in her course of action and that of the sisters outside Tarvalon's walls. Romanda found in herself a grudging respect for the girl. Very grudging, but she could not deny it. It had to be Egwene herself. The Hall kept a tight fist on the dream Terangrial, and though no one could find the one Liana had been loaned before that dire night, she and Swan had been practically at one another's throats. There was no question of Swan slipping into Tel'aran'rhiod to tell the woman what to say. Was it possible that Nisao had come to the same conclusion about Egwene without seeing her in the unseen world? That counsel had stuck very close to her. That is reason enough for you, Nisao? She could hardly slip the book back out without the other woman noticing. She shifted again, but there was no comfortable position on the thing. She was going to have a bruise if this continued. Nisao twisted her pewter cup about on the tabletop, but she still did not look away. It is my major reason. In the beginning, I thought she would end up as your pet, or Lelaine's. Later, when it was clear she had evaded both of you, I thought Swan must be holding the leash, but I soon learned I was wrong. Swan has been a teacher, I'm sure, and an advisor, and perhaps even a friend, but I've seen Egwene call her up short. No one has a leash on Egwene Alvear. She is intelligent, observant, quick to learn, and deft. She may become one of the great Amelins. The bird-like sister gave a sudden brief laugh. Do you realize? She will be the longest-sitting Amelin in history. No one will ever live long enough to top her, unless she chooses to step down early. Smiles faded to solemnity, and perhaps worry. Not because she had skirted the edge of violating custom, however. Nisao schooled her face well, but her eyes were tight. If we managed to unseat Elida, that is. Hearing her own thoughts thrown back at her with emendations was unnerving. The great Amethyst? Well, it would take many years to see whether that came about. But whether or not Egwene managed that considerable and unlikely feat, she would discover that the hall was much less amenable once her war powers expired. Romantic Cassin certainly would be. Respect was one thing, becoming a lapdog quite another. Standing on the pretext of straightening her deep yellow skirts, she drew the book from beneath the cushion as she sat back down and tried to drop it surreptitiously. It hit the carpet with a thud, and Misal's eyebrows twitched. Ramonda ignored that, pulling the book under the edge of the table with her foot. We will. She put more confidence than she felt into that. The peculiar negotiations and Egwene's continuing imprisonment gave her pause. Forget the girl's claims that she could undermine Elida from within. Though it seemed half her work had been done by others, if her reporting on the situation in the tower was accurate. But Ramonda believed because she had to believe. She had no intention of living cut off from her Aja, accepting penance until Elida thought her fit to be fully Aes Sedai again. No intention of accepting Elida Aroyhan as Amerlin. Better Lelaine than that. And one argument in her own mind for raising Egwene had been that it kept the stolen staff from Lelaine. No doubt Lelaine had thought the same concerning her. And I will inform Lelaine in no uncertain terms that you can ask any questions you wish. We must solve those murders, and the murder of any sister is every sister's concern. What have you learned so far? Not a proper question, perhaps, but being a sitter gave you certain privileges. At least, she had always believed it did. Nisao displayed no pique at being questioned, no hesitation in answering. Very little, I fear, she said ruefully, frowning at her wine cup. It seemed there must be some link between Anaya and Kyra, some reason they two were picked out. But all I've learned so far is that they had been close friends for many years. Blues called them and another Blue sister, Cabriana and Candace, the Three because they were so close. But they were all close-mouthed, too. No one recalls any of them talking about their own affairs, except with each other. In any event, friendship seems a feeble motive for murder. I hope I can find some reason why anyone would want to murder them, especially a man who can channel, but I confess it's a small hope. Ramonda furrowed her brow. Cabriana and Candace. She paid little attention to the other Ajas. Only the yellow had any truly useful function. How could any of their passions compare to healing? Yet that name chimed a small gong in the back of her head. Why? It would come to her, or not. It could not be important. Small hopes can grow surprising fruit, Misal. That's an old saying in farmatting, and it's true. Continue your investigation. In Egwene's absence, you may report what you learn to me. Misal blinked, and her jaw tightened briefly, but whether or not reporting to Ramonda sat well with her, there was little she could do but obey. She could hardly claim interference in her affairs. Murder could not be one sister's affair. Besides, Magla might have gotten her ridiculous choice for the third yellow sitter, yet Ramonda had secured the position of first weaver for herself easily. After all, she'd been head of the yellow before she retired, and even Magla had been unwilling to stand against her. The position carried much less power than she would have liked, but at least she could count on obedience in most things, from yellow sisters, if not sitters at least. As Nisao untied her ward against eavesdropping and let it dissipate, Theodrin popped into the tent. She was wearing her shawl spread across her shoulders and down her arms to display the long fringe, as newly raised sisters often did. Though willowy Damani had chosen brown after Egwene granted her that shawl, but the brown had not known what to do with her, despite finally accepting her. They'd seemed ready to largely ignore her, entirely the wrong thing, so Ramonda had taken her in. Theodrin tried to behave as if she really were Aes Sedai, yet she was a bright, level-headed girl for all that. She spread her brown woolen skirts in a curtsy. A small curtsy, but a curtsy. She was well aware that she had no right to the shawl until she had been tested, and passed. It would have been cruel not to make sure she understood. Lelaine has called a sitting of the hall, she said breathlessly. I couldn't find out why. I ran to tell you, but I didn't want to intrude while the ward was up. And rightly not, Ramonda said. Nisao, if you will excuse me, I must see what Lelaine is about. Gathering her yellow-fringed shawl from atop one of the chests holding her clothing, she arranged it over her arms and checked her hair in the cracked mirror before herding the others outside and seeing them on their way. It was not so much that she thought Nisao would have looked for what had made that thud if left in the tent alone, and she was certain Theodrin would not, but it was better to take no chances. Aelmara would replace the book where it belonged, with several similar volumes in the chest that held Ramonda's personal possessions. That had a very stout lock with only 2 keys, one kept in her belt pouch, the other in Aelmara's. The morning was crisp, yet spring had arrived with a rush. The dark clouds massing behind Dragon Mount's shattered peak would deliver rain rather than snow, though not on the camp, it was to be hoped. Many of the tents leaked, and the camp streets were a bog already. Horse carts making deliveries splashed mud from their high wheels as they made new ruts, driven by women for the most part, and a few gray-haired men. Male access to the Aes Sedai camp was strictly limited now. Even so, nearly every sister she saw glided along the uneven wooden walkways wrapped in the light of Saidar, and followed by her warder if she had one. Romonda refused to embrace the source whenever she went outside. Someone had to set an example of proper behavior, with every sister in the camp on tenterhooks, yet she was very conscious of the lack. Conscious of the lack of a warder, too. Keeping most men out of the camp was all very well, but a murderer was unlikely to pay any heed to the restriction. Down the street, Gareth Bryn rode out of a crossing street, a stocky man with mostly gray hair, his breastplate strapped over a buff-colored coat and his helmet hanging from his saddle-bow. Swan was with him, swaying on a plump, shaggy mare and looking such a pretty girl that it was almost possible to forget she had been hard-bitten and sharp-tongued as Amelin. Easy to forget she was still an accomplished schemer. Blues always were. The mare plodded along, but Swan nearly fell off before Bryn reached out to steady her. At the edge of the blue quarters, the camp was laid out in rough approximation of the Aja quarters in the tower. He dismounted long enough to help her down, then climbed back into his baize saddle and left her standing there, holding the mare's reins and gazing after him. Now why would she do that? Blacking the man's boots, doing his laundry. That relationship was abhorrent. The Blue should put an end to it, and to the pit of doom with custom. However strong, custom should not be abused to hold all Aes Sedai up to ridicule. Turning her back on Swan, she started toward the pavilion that served as their temporary hall of the tower. As pleasant as it was to meet in the true hall, not to mention under Elida's very nose, few sisters could manage to put themselves to sleep at any hour, so the pavilion must continue to serve. She glided along the walkway without haste. She was not about to be seen hurrying to answer Lelaine's call. What could the woman want now? A gong sounded, magnified with the power, so it carried across the camp clearly, another of Sharina's suggestions, and suddenly the walkways were crowded with novices hurrying to their next class or to chores, all clustered by family. Those families of 6 or 7 always attended class together, did chores together, in fact did everything together. It was an effective way to manage so many novices. Nearly 50 more had wandered into the camp in just the last 2 weeks, pushing the total back near 1,000 in spite of runaways, and almost a quarter of those were young enough to be proper novices, more than the tower had held in centuries. Yet she wished it were not Sharina's work. The woman had not even suggested it to the mistress of novices. She had organized the thing herself and presented it to Tiana whole and complete. The novices, some of them graying or with lines in their faces, so that it was difficult to think of them as children, despite their white dresses, squeezed to the edge of the walkway to let sisters pass while they offered curtsies, but none stepped into the muddy street to make more room. Sharina, again. Sharina had spread the word that she did not want to see the girls dirtying their nice white woolens unnecessarily. It was enough to make Ramonda grind her teeth. The novices who curtsied to her straightened hurriedly and practically ran. Ahead of her, she spotted Sharina
I'll
herself,
be right back.
talking to Tiana, who was shrouded in the glow of Sidar, doing all of the talking, with Tiana merely nodding now and then. There was nothing disrespectful in Sharina's demeanor, but despite novice white, with her creased face and gray hair and a tight bun on the back of her head, she looked exactly what she was, a grandmother. And Tiana had an unfortunately youthful appearance. Something about her bone structure and large brown eyes overwhelmed the ageless look of Aes Sedai. Lack of disrespect or no, there was too much appearance of a woman instructing her granddaughter to suit Ramonda. As she approached them, Sharina offered a proper curtsy, a very proper curtsy, Ramonda had to admit, and hurried off the other way to join her own family, waiting for her. Were there fewer lines in her face than there had been? Well, there was no saying what might happen when a woman began with the power at her age. 67, and a novice. Is she giving you difficulties? She asked, and Tiana leaped as though an icicle had slid down the back of her dress. The woman lacked the dignity, the gravity necessary in a mistress of novices. At times she seemed smothered by the number of her charges, too, and she was much too lenient besides, accepting excuses where there could be none. She recovered quickly, however, falling in beside Ramonda, though she smoothed her dark gray skirts unnecessarily. Difficulties? Of course not. Sharina is the best behaved novice in the book. Truth to tell, most are well behaved. The greatest number sent to my study are mothers upset because their daughters are learning faster than they, or have a higher potential, or aunts with the same complaint of nieces. They seem to believe the matter can be rectified somehow. They can be surprisingly adamant about it until I set them straight about being adamant with any sister. Though a good many have been sent to me more than once, I fear. A handful still seem surprised that they can be switched. Is that so? Ramonda said absently. Her eye had caught pale-haired Delana hurrying in the same direction, gray-fringed shawl looped over her arms, and her so-called secretary striding at her side. Delana wore an almost somber dark gray, but the Saranoff trollop was in blue/green silk that left half her bosom on display and fit much too snugly over hips that she rolled blatantly. Of late, the pair of them seemed to have abandoned the story that Halima was merely Delana's servant. Indeed, the woman was gesturing emphatically while Delana merely nodded in the meekest manner imaginable. Meek! It was always a mistake to choose a pillow friend who did not wear the shawl, especially if you were fool enough to let her take the lead. Sharina isn't only well behaved, Tiana continued blithely. She is showing a great skill with Nynaeve's new way of healing, like a number of the older novices. Most were village wise women of one sort or another, though I don't see how that can have any bearing. One was a noble in Nuremberg. Ramonda tripped over her own heel and staggered 2 paces, arms flailing for balance before she could catch herself and gather her shawl. Tiana put a hand on her arm to steady her, murmuring about the unevenness of the walkway's planking, but she shook it off. Sharina had a gift for the new healing? And a number of the older women? She herself had learned the new way, but while it was different enough from the old that the second learned weave limitation seemed not to apply, she had no great gift for it. Not nearly what she had for the old method. And why are novices being allowed to practice that,
Cheers.
Tiana? Tiana flushed, as well she should. Such weaves were much too complex for novices, not to mention dangerous if misapplied. Done improperly, healing could kill rather than cure. The woman channeling as well as the patient. I can hardly stop them from seeing healing done, Ramonda, she said defensively, moving her arms as if adjusting a shawl she was not wearing. There are always broken bones or some fool who's managed to cut himself badly, not to mention all the illness we've had to deal with lately. Most of the older women only have to see a weave once to have it down. Abruptly, for a bare instant, red returned to her cheeks. Smoothing her face, she drew herself up, and defensiveness fell away from her voice. In any event, Ramonda, I shouldn't need to remind you that the novices and accepted are mine. As mistress of novices, I decide what they can learn and when. Some of those women could test for accepted today after only months, when it comes to the power at least. If I choose not to make them twiddle their thumbs idly, it is my decision to make. Perhaps you should run see whether Sharina has any further instructions for you, Romonda said coldly. Spots of crimson staining her cheeks, Tiana turned on her heel and strode away without another word. Not quite forbidden rudeness, but close. Even from behind she was the image of indignation, her back stiff as an iron rod, her steps quick. Well, Romonda was willing to admit she had come near rudeness herself, but with cause. Trying to put the mistress of novices out of her mind, she set out toward the pavilion again, but had to restrain herself to keep from walking as fast as Tiana. Sharina. And several of the other older women. Should she rethink her position? No, of course not. Their names should never have been allowed in the novice book in the first place. Yet their names were there, and it seemed they had mastered this wonderful new healing. Oh, it was a tangled snarl. She did not want to think about it. Not now. The pavilion stood at the heart of the camp, a much patched piece of heavy canvas surrounded by a walkway 3 times as wide as any of the others. Holding her skirts well up out of the mud, she hurried across to it. She did not mind haste when it got her out of the mud more quickly. Even so, Elmara would have a time cleaning her shoes and her petticoats, she thought as she let her skirts down, decently concealing her ankles once more. Word of the hall sitting always drew sisters hoping for news of the negotiations or of Egwene, and a good 50 or more were already gathered around the pavilion with their warders, or standing just inside, behind where their sitters would sit. Even here, most shone with the light of the power, as if they were in any danger, surrounded by other Aes Sedai. She found herself with a strong urge to walk around the pavilion, boxing ears. That was impossible, of course. Even if custom could be set aside, which she had no desire to do, a chair in the hall gave no authority for such a thing. Shiriam, the narrow blue stole of the keeper vivid on her shoulders, stood out in the crowd, in part because there was a clear space around her. Other sisters were avoiding looking at her, much less approaching her. The flame-haired woman embarrassed many of the sisters, appearing every time the hall was called to sit as she did. The law was quite clear. Any sister could attend the sitting of the hall unless it was closed, yet the Amerlin could not enter the hall of the tower without being announced by the keeper, and the keeper was not allowed in without the Amerlin. Shiriam's green eyes were tight, as usual, and she fidgeted in an unbecoming manner, like a novice who knew she was due another visit to the mistress of novices. At least she was not embracing the source, and her warder was nowhere in sight. Before stepping beneath the pavilion, Romonda glanced over her shoulder and sighed. The great bulk of black clouds behind Dragonmount was gone, not drifting apart, simply gone entirely. Very likely there would be another wave of panic among the grooms and laborers and the serving women. Surprisingly, the novices seemed to take these strange occurrences more in stride. Perhaps that was because they were trying to take their cues from the sisters, but she suspected Sharina's hand again. What was she to do about the woman? Inside, 18 cloth-covered boxes, colored for the 6 Ajas represented in the camp, made platforms for polished benches, 2 slanting rows atop the layered carpets, widening toward a box covered with stripes in all 7 colors. Wisely, Egwene had insisted on including red, despite considerable opposition. Where Elida seemed determined to divide every Aja from every other, Egwene was determined to hold them all together, including the red. The wooden bench atop that platform had the Amerlin's 7-striped stole laid across it. No one claimed responsibility for placing it there, but no one had removed it either. Romonda was uncertain whether it was meant to be a reminder of Egwene Alvir, the Amerlin's seat, an echo of her presence, or a reminder that she was absent and a prisoner. How it was seen, doubtless, depended on the sister looking. She was not the only sitter taking her time to answer Lelane's call. Delana was there, of course. slumped on her bench and rubbing the side of her nose, her watery blue eyes pensive. Once Romanda had considered her level-headed, unsuitable for a chair, but level-headed. At least she had not allowed Halima to follow her into the hall and continue her harangue, or rather, at least Halima had chosen not to. No one who had heard the woman shouting at Delana possessed any doubts who gave the orders there. Lelaine herself was already on her bench, just below the Amelins, a slender, hard-eyed woman in blue-slashed silk who rationed her smiles tightly, which made it doubly odd that now and then she glanced toward the seven-colored stole and gave a small smile. That smile made Rolanda uneasy, and few things could do that. Moria, in blue wool embroidered with silver, was striding up and down in front of the blue-covered platforms. Was her frown because she knew why Lelaine had called the hall and disapproved, or because she was worried over not knowing? "I saw Mirelle walking with Sue," Malin said, hitching up her green-fringed shawl as Rolanda entered the pavilion, "and I don't think I've ever seen a sister looking so harassed." Despite the sympathy in her tone, her eyes sparkled and her full lips quirked with amusement. "How did you ever talk her into bonding him? I was there when someone suggested it to her, and I vow she turned pale. The man could almost pass for an ogier. I expressed myself forcefully on duty." Faisella, stocky and square-faced, was forceful in everything. In truth, a hammer of a woman. She mocked every tale of seductive Damani. "I pointed out that Hlu had been becoming more and more dangerous to himself and others since Chiron died, and I told her it couldn't be allowed to continue. I made her see that, as the only sister ever to save two other warders in the same circumstances, she was the only choice to try doing it again. I'll admit I had to twist her arm a little, but eventually she saw the right of the matter." "How under the light could you twist Mirelle's arm?" Malin leaned forward eagerly. Romanda passed them by. How could anyone have twisted Mirelle's arm? No, no gossip. Janya was on her bench for the brown, squinting in thought. At least she was squinting, but the woman always seemed to be thinking of something else, even when she was talking to you. Maybe her eyes were bad. The rest of the benches still stood empty, though. Romanda wished she had been more leisurely. She would much rather have been the last to arrive than one of the first. After a moment's hesitation, she approached Lelaine. "Would you care to give an idea of why you called the hall?" Lelaine smiled down at her, an amused smile, yet unpleasant even so. "You might as well wait until we have enough sitters to proceed. I don't care to repeat myself. I will tell you this much. It will be dramatic." Her eyes drifted to the striped stole, and Romanda felt a chill. She did not let it show, however, merely taking her bench across from Lelaine. She could not help glancing uneasily at the stole herself. Was this some move to unseat Egwene? It seemed unlikely the other woman could say anything that would convince her to stand for the greater consensus.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone will keep stopping by. I appreciate all your support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.